Daniel, you're challenging the Congressional Task Force on the declassification of federal secrets, headed by Representative Luna and Representative Burchett, to do a real investigation of covert operations. What do you want their hearings to focus on?
This is very interesting because I guess people who are deep researchers like myself around this have waited for Congress to investigate these kinds of things. And we finally got this DECLAS Committee, and they came out with a big promise. They said, we're going to declassify federal secrets, and we're going to do it in a fashion that's transparent to the public. Now, some of the things that have happened in relation to this, they have released over 80,000 records in the JFK assassination, for example. But I've pointed out to them that the most important records, for example, the records concerning George Joannides, who was their top psychological warfare officer, never got released. So you're getting the transparency, but you're not getting the real sort of juicy parts. And what the challenge to the committee is, as these hearings are going on, and they end in the fall, so it's a limited window, and there's a kind of history of this limited window thing. You get enough done in that period of time, and that's it. So the challenge for us now is when they are looking at things like the JFK assassination, the assassination of the political structures from the deep state in the 1960s, all the way through the 80s into the 2000s, and the various deep events in American history, by the time we get to today with what they're bringing out, if they're just going to bring out, oh, you know, there may have been some mafia people involved, there may have been the Cubans involved, but the government covered up because they needed to at the time, then that's the fake story. That's not a declassification committee. Because if you're just looking at this, you know, for example, the government can go in and change an autopsy, as they did in President Kennedy's death. The mafia can't change an autopsy. And they can't influence the national media to go to sleep. So we need to take these things for what they literally are. Now, the DECLAS Committee is also going into the RFK assassination, who was going to be president. Of course, that's the Attorney General, who was President Kennedy's brother, who got assassinated, also under mysterious circumstances. So once we go from there, then we get to the UFO file. That's the other piece. So they're working on all three. That's the DECLAS Committee, and it's headed up by Representative Luna of Florida, Anna Luna, and Tim Burchett of Tennessee, both of them making big noises about we're being transparent and all the rest of it. But as we go along tonight, we're going to find out that counterintelligence people have crept into those committees and are now running those committees. So they're at a pivotal point. So this broadcast that we're doing is literally a response to the DECLAS Committee saying, you're going off the rails, here is where you should be looking. And we'll make that case on this tonight.
Beautiful. How is executive action, assassination, related to black budget exotic technology, and is the classification of this activity included in Executive Order 14176?
That executive order is very important. It just came out in 2025 from this new administration, coming in and saying the government needs to declassify these federal secrets. So that is a wide berth in terms of what can happen and what needs to be declassified. So all the records pertaining to this secret activity around assassination in the case of the JFK assassination and Robert Kennedy's assassination and the MLK assassination. So you see there's some acknowledgement on the government side that yes, all of these things are related. There is an assassination program. So that brings us into what is executive action? Well, executive action is something that was developed by the Central Intelligence Agency to remove a foreign leader if it became in the purpose of the United States. So someone in Guatemala is giving us a hard time. We go in there, size up the situation.
Cambodia.
Yes. Can we bribe him or do we have to take him out? In Iran, all the way back in 1953, we installed someone named Mossadegh. And he, instead of doing what the Central Intelligence Agency wanted, he created an entire situation where he nationalized the oil fields. So we decided we need to take him out, and unceremoniously we removed the same guy that we put in. And this happened at a series of countries across the world from right after World War II. It continues on until today. So it was particularly apparent when they set it up, though, how much fingerprints of the Central Intelligence Agency were on this. One of the things that we need to do is look at executive action and say, did they turn the Executive Action Committee and that propensity into the United States? Did they take executive action and use it to remove the President of the United States all the way back in 1963? That's declassification. That's what the order states that we need to be doing. So executive action is something that goes very deep in the history, and it is completely illegal, which is another part of this, which is a problem, because when we set up the national security state, through the National Security Act, there's a charter in there for the Central Intelligence Agency that goes something like this. If the Central Intelligence Agency or its various connections are found to have been committing unlawful acts, they cannot be prosecuted. We never get to look at that charter in the public, and this is part of the problem. So at a certain point, they were off the hook. And when you were looking at Eisenhower administration into the Kennedy administration, the Central Intelligence Agency had started to usurp the power of that overt government by presenting the covert government, usurping the public government. So this is where we stood at that time. By the time you get into the Kennedy presidency, he is looking at all this. And immediately when he gets into the presidency, it is the Bay of Pigs that the Central Intelligence Agency, an invasion of Cuba, that they've hoisted upon him. And so instantly he realizes, oh, I've been tricked, and the Central Intelligence Agency is trying to use me to get into a war in Cuba, and he fires the sacred cows in intelligence, including Allen Dulles and all the rest, who have set up everything from the OSS, the Central Intelligence Agency, and he's been in charge of the Central Intelligence Agency since 1953. So Dulles was a core figure in setting this up. And what we'll find when Kennedy is assassinated is that Dulles is the person who oversees the Warren Commission. So Kennedy fired him, he gets assassinated, and then they call him in to basically cover it up. So this is the nature of executive action. Its foundations in the Central Intelligence Agency. They used it to remove President Kennedy, and then they used it for the cover-up after the fact. So, in fact, the DECLAS Committee, with the executive order, has the power to say the Central Intelligence Agency did a deep state revolt against the presidency. And now, as an agency, we either dissolve it or we acknowledge it and move on. But you can't remain in that space of pretending it didn't happen or that it was the mafia or something else like we were talking about.
Right.
And what they came up with, and we'll talk about this tonight, which is Lee Harvey Oswald is a lone gunman, is absurd, because I'm going to show you tonight actual testimony from the police in the very beginning, who said that what they found wasn't even Oswald's rifle. They found a totally different rifle at the scene of the crime. And that's part of what we want to enter into the actual congressional record on this.
Mm. What is X-Protect, and who are the figures involved through recent history who were silenced as witnesses by this group to keep all the wall of secrecies in place?
Well, X-Protect is something we've identified, and it's a group inside the Central Intelligence Agency that works around exotic technology. So there's a wing in there that deals specifically with that. This goes all the way back to a physicist in the 1950s named Robert Sarbarker, sort of accidentally spoke to an interviewer and was saying, oh yeah, the major subject that we keep at a higher level than nuclear secrecy is UFO secrecy. So the technology that was involved with UFOs, and there's a number of things to track there, whether you're talking about if you think it's an off-world visitation or if it's just very advanced technology that we developed through the Nazi period and others where we just usurped the technology and applied it, however you want to look at it. And I'm inclined to think it's some combination of all of the above. Mm-hmm. But it became the top national security secret for a reason, which is there's a capacity to it that gives a country kind of an unlimited power. And they didn't want to share that the same way they didn't want to share the nuclear secrecy in the beginning. So the UFO file becomes kind of core in the middle of this. The group that's set up to sort of punish those who reveal those secrets or destroy their reputations or ultimately assassinate them. This is the group X-Protect. It comes directly out of the intelligence wing, but it operates between the aerospace companies who are public, not government, and the intelligence agencies who are part of the intelligence community and the apparatus therein. So they're able to operate in this kind of haze between the two. It's an unusual kind of a dark corridor, you could say, between the two. And what happened is when people have stumbled into that corridor, so figures like Judge Jim Garrison, for example, is the only DA who prosecuted a case in the Kennedy murder. Very famously, Dorothy Kilgallen, who was a journalist who understood things in relation to the UFO file, but she was a very popular journalist in that period of time. She was on TV, she was on game shows. I mean, she was ubiquitous. And then suddenly she died very mysteriously after interviewing Jack Ruby, who, famously shot Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin in the Kennedy case. So whenever you get into this corridor, you become a target. And so the question is, are they going to destroy your reputation? In Garrison's case, they didn't assassinate him. They ruined his reputation and ruined his life. It's very interesting to note that in 1991, Oliver Stone did the JFK movie, and he got a lot of this out. In fact, they created something which was the Kennedy Records Act, which was release all the records back then, 1992. And they said, well, you have to release them within 25 years. Well, 2017 came around, and right in this very environment, I was doing a live stream, and I was going to release, the records as they came out. And guess what? They didn't allow anything out, even though the deadline was there. So they waited until 2025, 8 years later, to release those records, and then they didn't let out the key records, as we're going to get into tonight, like the Joe and Eddie's files. So when people get into this corridor, and they either come in through, they can come in through a number of different places. You could be a reporter who stumbles into it. A lot of astronomers have got into it, and political analysts, social studies analysts. Whatever it is, or wherever they happen to be coming from, you're going to find this unusual backlash that takes place. And then suddenly you've got a list of unexplained deaths, or you have people who fall off the radar, or things just tend to go bad for them. And so the X-Protect group is very active. And as a buffer to them, there's something called X-Share. And we're going to get into the X-Share group later as we talk. But the X-Share group wants to use the same technology for moving things out there to the public.
Interesting.
So I'd say to kind of summarize it from here, when you're looking at X-Protect, you're looking at a group that's dedicated to keeping the secrecy at any cost. And it doesn't matter who the target is, including the President of the United States. That's what the Kennedy assassination teaches us as a legacy. Here it is 60 years later, and 61 years later, we get some records related to it. And the CIA, even at that point, is holding records back, the most key, important records, in my opinion. And I'll mention some of the records that came out and some of the things that we learned as a result. Now, I should say that there's a secondary group here involved, which is the X-Share group. And the X-Share group are much smaller, but you can see their footprints in history trying to move the culture forward, saying, here's the advanced technology. We do have the advanced technology, and let's share that with the public. And it is those people that we can track all the way back, for example, to 1946. And their presence in history. And it's very unusual because I count people like President Kennedy, for example, in that X-Share group, because we're going to find out the major motivation in the assassination was over the advanced technology and the fact that Kennedy wanted to share that UFO file with the Russians. So you can see we're going to go places the DECLAS never could.
What is the clearest evidence for a UFO connection to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy and Senator Robert Kennedy in the 1960s?
It's important you mentioned Robert Kennedy there, because I think as the younger brother, his assassination doesn't get as much attention. But it's very interesting to note that he was on the road to being the next president of the United States. And we can only imagine the kind of retribution for that deep state with his own investigation into his brother's murder. He was the Attorney General after all. And he was winning in 1968 when he was assassinated. And so there's a big aerospace footprint, I'll mention there, in his assassination. It's quite unusual. But in President Kennedy's assassination, there are a number of testimonials right off the bat. For example, the Watergate lawyer, Douglas Caddy, came forward on my program, Dark Journalist, and he said he was close friends with E. Howard Hunt, who was the CIA super spy. And this is interesting because Caddy, you know, he's one of these figures who's a Watergate figure. He's a historical figure, so in a way, just from his background, what he says has a little more weight than if somebody were just to say this randomly. And what we get with Caddy's statement is this. He said he was best friends with E. Howard Hunt. And by the way, I talked to E. Howard Hunt's son, St. John Hunt, who told me, yeah, Caddy was my dad's best friend, and he was around, and I was growing up and all the rest of it. And he has a very deep background, starting in World War II with the OSS and then into the CIA. And he was the top CIA super spy. And so he got into trouble during the Watergate deep event, being part of the plumbers with Nixon. And Caddy was his lawyer. In fact, Caddy was the lawyer for the Watergate 7. It's a pretty, you know, kind of major place in history there. And so he's going to prison because they've realized the extent of the things that he's done. And before he goes to prison, Caddy, you know, they go out for Chinese dinner there in Washington, D.C. And they're talking about things. He's trying to get him to get into anything deep. And he's starting to reveal some things to him on the way out. So just as they're leaving the restaurant, he says, I have to know, Howard, what was it with the Central Intelligence Agency assassinating President Kennedy? Why was he assassinated? And so Hunt stopped and looked at his friend in private and said, John Kennedy was killed because he was about to give our most vital national security secret to the Russians. And Caddy was shocked. He said, Kennedy was going to give our secrets to the Russians? What secret are you talking about? And Hunt stopped and looked at him and said, the UFO file, the alien presence. He was going to share it with the Russians. Now, then he went off to prison, and Caddy probably never talked to him ever again. But Caddy wanted to go on the record with that, and he's a man in his 80s. Now a number of national security officials from that era have come forward. I talked to one of them who really went on the record just recently, and he just passed away. He was an elderly man as well, but he was a national security staffer. His name is Malmgren, Harold Malmgren, and he passed away just in February. But what he put on the record, and he was, you know, God love him, he was putting this out on Twitter X and all the rest of it. But I talked to him, and what he said was, look, I wasn't directly involved with the UFO program, but I was briefed on otherworldly technologies. And he said it publicly. And then he said, when asked, do you think JFK was assassinated because he wanted to share the UFO file, he said, I think the number one reason why Kennedy was assassinated was the UFO file. It's another national security person on the inside. Kennedy was well briefed on the UFO file, and his history with the UFO file went all the way back to his time when the first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, was his best friend. And Forrestal, becoming the first national director of national defense, he took Kennedy, a young Jack Kennedy, all the way to Berlin in 1946 when Kennedy wasn't even anything. He wasn't in politics. He was a journalist. And so here's Kennedy walking through the ruins and hearing all these stories about how the Russians didn't believe Hitler was dead and all these types of things. And somewhere along the way, Forrestal sits him down and shares with him the UFO file story. And so Kennedy is already in the know on this subject. By the way, Forrestal will very unceremoniously be dumped out of a window at Bethesda Naval Hospital only a year after becoming the Secretary of Defense. He suffers from a bout of depression. And so it's a pretty interesting background with Forrestal, because what we understand from the Majestic 12 documents is that Forrestal wanted, he's part of the X-Share. He said, I don't think we should keep these secrets. We should share it with the public. And they're looking at him, he's the Secretary of Defense. The first one, by the way. We didn't even have a Secretary of Defense until him. So they merged after World War I and World War II. So Forrestal says, this is what I want to do. And he also, there's an episode, they say, where he went to look at captured bodies, that is, dead bodies from these crafts. and that he had some kind of a psychological reaction to this, telepathic link, whatever it would happen to be, but he realized we can't keep this secret. So Forrestal and Kennedy, that death of Forrestal out that window at Bethesda is quite interesting on Kennedy's side because it's a very close personal loss, and yet he's thinking, I know this guy was privy to these secrets that he was sharing with me, and I know he was one of the main people on this Majestic 12 group. So Kennedy and the UFO file, the interface goes back a long ways. And then if you go even further in there, you'll see Kennedy is part of the Office of Naval Intelligence during World War II. And when these incidents start to come up, he is somebody who gets briefed. So Kennedy already has that sort of background in exotic technology. We need to keep that in mind if we're to understand him and his assassination. And when you get to that point of him developing the space program, the moonshot, and developing NASA to the level and saying, we choose to go to the moon, he is really taking that aerospace side on and saying, the president-in-chief is who you answer to. And when it comes to the secrecy, we're also going to spread it with these other countries, because in Kennedy's case, and we'll get into this later, but Kennedy, the main reason he wanted to share the UFO file was to prevent a nuclear exchange with the Russians. And it was to lower national security tensions in relation to that. And they had done a lot inside of that national security state to prevent the two from meeting, Khrushchev and Kennedy. And when they did, it's very interesting because Kennedy's like, I don't want any CIA people, I don't want any State Department people, I only want the translator. And you'll find this thing mimicked later with, for example, Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev, and with Trump and Putin. And whenever it happens, everyone hits the ceiling. Oh, he's a traitor, he wants to meet with him alone. No, it's because if the two leaders exchange over the UFO file, they go around the whole cadre of the vetted people in Ex-Protect, the CIA, the State Department, that control structure over this very exotic technology. Mm-hmm. And since we're talking about the UFO file, President Kennedy was headed to meet physicist Lloyd Berkner at the Trade Mart in Dallas when he was assassinated. Now, Berkner had been in Antarctica with Admiral Byrd, whose cousin D.H. Byrd owned the Texas School Book Depository. Berkner ran the Robertson panel, and after the assassination said the speech that he was going to have given with Kennedy was going to have international implications, and they were going to fly in Air Force One. There was some kind of ceremony with the flag from the White House. So something major was planned there that didn't happen. I did an entire documentary on this just recently, JFK and the UFO file, the final speech. So you can see we're in deep territory here with JFK, Berkner, and the exotic technology trail.
Danielle, can you please tell me why is secret aerospace technology at the heart of these federal secrets? What is the secret space program and breakaway X-Tech?
Now, isn't this interesting? Because here we are asking the kinds of questions that if we lived in the type of society that was actually open with these things, we would know. And I think an average person would say they could accept some secrecy because, every government has secrets in order to compete with other governments. But the secrecy has become so overwhelming, that wall of secrecy has created a situation where the general public now has a schizophrenic relationship to the government because we can no longer accept blindly what they have to say. And on the media side, there's a kind of superficial treatment of these topics, the UFO file, executive action, the deep state, et cetera. They're dealing with it for pops and clicks and things, but they're not going into the deeper aspects of it. So what is it? Well, if you go back into that program, if you really look at the UFO file, you will find that in the late 1940s, we were redeveloping what appeared to be a crashed craft from somewhere else. Now, whether it was from somewhere else or a very advanced group here goes into two different lines of thoughts. But in any case, it was far more advanced than our jet fighters and things along this line. So with that technology, which came on heavy in 1946 and 47 in particular is the year that it explodes, with the Roswell case and all these types of things. You know, the Kenneth Arnold sighting, and he's out there, he's flying, he's a very legitimate pilot with a great background, and he sees this incredible swarm of these craft. They're actually boomerang shaped, even though we get the term flying saucer. And he said, isn't that interesting? The way that they're flying in formation reminds me of when I used to throw a saucer and it would skip across a pond. And so the guy who's writing the story, when Kenneth Arnold touches down, writes flying saucer. So this is where we get the whole terminology. And it's interesting to me, though, because there's something breaking there where they've just come out of World War II. So the question is, do they say, well, we're going to come to the public and say, there's a whole unexplained thing there. There are these craft flying around. They're far more superior, but don't worry about it, you know. Instead, what they decided to do was say, whatever it is that people are seeing is not a national security threat. Therefore, we don't need to talk about it. They didn't say it didn't exist. They said it's not a national security threat. Later, it became, oh, it's the planet Venus, you didn't see it. And it got worse, actually, after the original waves, because the waves were so overwhelming, if you go back to that period, that there are vast communities of people who were seeing these things. Now, why they were showing up in such numbers in that period becomes interesting also. And some of the questions that are raised are, when we exploded our atomic bombs for the first time, did that attract somebody's attention? It's quite possible. So there's a number of things, but also the German technology had taken us to a place. And I mentioned John Warner IV, who's a guest in my program, and he is the son of Catherine Mellon, who's the Mellon heiress of the Mellon banking family. And there's a lot involved, let's say, in that majestic aerospace side with the Mellon family. And we're going to find that out when we get to the heart of the congressional hearings, because there's a Mellon involved in the middle of that also. So, but one of the things that he talked about was a meeting with his grandfather, Paul Mellon, who is the son of Andrew Mellon, who was the Secretary of the Treasury and a real mover and a shaker in the government. And Paul Mellon is sitting there with a cocktail and musing to him about going over to Germany right after the war as part of the United States military, and said, you know, when we went into Peenemünde, which is the secret Nazi mountain base where they were developing all this advanced things like the V-2 rockets with von Braun and everything else, he said, I stood on a saucer. And when I stood on it, I looked out and it was, the diameter was a football field and a half. So that's 150-yard diameter. And we were able to retrieve that. Now, that's not, there's no kind of delineation in history where we go from the kind of planes that we fought with in World War II to that. So there's nothing of 150 diameter, a saucer, you know. So something very advanced was happening in Germany at the time. There's no question about it. The level, you know, of understanding is, were they working with crash retrievals? Were they ahead of us in relation to that because of this? So we have to look at it and say, regardless of where the technology came from, the problem arose in the late 40s after World War II, because they had this decision to make. And what they did is they put together a group, which is often referred to as Majestic 12, and they said, we're going to have them oversee this to make sure the secrecy never gets out, but also that there's some managing group. And the person who managed the group was Vannevar Bush, who was our top scientist inside the government. So the breakaway side of it is these people control a breakaway technology. I refer to the technology as X technology because there's steganography whenever they use it classically, where they have the term X involved in all of the various advanced programs. And of course, you know, we laugh with something like, you know, the X-Files, and it's just kind of like the blow-off thing. But deep inside there is an actual program which used that steganography. And it was Bush who used it. And he actually uncorked a very ancient way of moving these programs through different government agencies by using this ancient naming system, which is this X steganography. So the X-Tech, the problem that they have with the X-Tech is there's a function of it that I refer to as apotheum, which they call a reality distortion field. So when they get around these things, for example, when they had their scientists studying them, the scientists would go in there for 20 minutes and study some advanced craft that had been landed in Arizona or somewhere. And they thought, oh, we'll do a regular study of this. But within 20 minutes, they would start doing things like seeing relatives who had passed away. So the physics that are involved there have nothing to do with what we understand as physics. And it's funny because I spent a lot of time with Professor John Mack, who was a professor at Harvard, who gave up a lot of his own career in order to study UFOs. And at the time, he got a lot, he got hassled for it pretty heavily. This is the early 2000s, really. But what he said was, when I'm watching these abduction cases, all these abduction cases, these people came to him, I was abducted by a UFO, that kind of thing. And he said, well, but they're going through things. They're going through walls, their car is being lifted, like these are defying physics. Well, if you go into, and the more that I researched the UFO file, those cases all involve a kind of alternative physics. And the whole thing about missing time and time stopping, so there's something operational there that if it becomes weaponized, becomes sort of the ultimate super weapon. So their excuse for hiding the technology from the public is the incredible advantage and saying, well, if somebody else gets their hands on that, for example, the Russians are very close on our heels with it because they have their own crash retrieval programs. So they're saying, this is our reasoning for it. By the time we get to something like a breakaway incident like the Kennedy assassination, that deep event, as I've proven, it's related to the aerospace technology, the exotic technology in the UFO file. That advanced technology and his willingness to share it made him a national security target. So this is the thing that something like a DECLAS committee would investigate. This is the problem that we arrive at again and again when you get around these things. If you do the superficial trail on the top, you'll end up with common things as we've discussed. And they can always say, well, it was either this lone gunman who was upset at Kennedy and just got a lucky shot around Secret Service and all the infrastructure of secrecy, or it was anti-Castro Cubans at the time, because Castro was such a target. Well, my question always when they get around the anti-Castro thing is, if they were anti-Castro and they couldn't assassinate him, how did they assassinate our president? It doesn't make any sense. So those explanations and the trails and the layers of narrative storytelling about them are complete bunk. If you look into the case, from the minute go, aerospace is involved because the shots that come from the building, the person who owned the building owned an experimental aerospace company, and that's D.H. Byrd, and we'll get into him as we go along. So I hope that answers the question, but when you get into the breakaway part, they show up in history. They sort of cause this damage, and then they retreat back into the shadows, and we're left to think, oh, how did 9/11 happen, or how did the JFK assassination happen? There's a lot of things there that don't really add up when you're doing a regular investigation, and that gets us into dark journalism.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
Now, you mentioned this earlier about the technology not necessarily following the laws of physics. We know that math as we understand it kind of breaks down. Do you think that what they're trying to protect is not so much the technology as is sort of the mechanisms of quote-unquote real physics?
Yeah, well, when you introduce, what your question reminds me of CERN and the Large Hadron Collider that's going on there, for example. So they're going into a different line of physics. I think on their side, they understand it, and they understand the reality distortion physics, but they don't want to share it, and this is where the problem comes in. You could say there are national security issues with sharing it, but after 80 years of captivity, how much does that work? And the other thing is, the way that a society works generally is one guy makes a scientific breakthrough, this other female scientist picks up on it, this guy picks up on it, and that's how science progresses. If you take all the scientific advancement off the table, what are you left with? You are left with one small group, tiny group, with immense power operating inside of this national security structure. How much of the secret financing is involved with that? And how much of your society is set up around the secret financing? And tonight we're going to get into secret structures in relation to this. Now here's a question. If you get the DECLAS Committee, when they go into the UFO file piece, they're not going to touch anything about apotheum. They're not going to touch anything about the deep physics involved. The only thing they're going to try to do is create either an open-ended conversation that says, oh, we don't know, we haven't been studying it for 80 years, we don't know what it is, which is totally false.
Right, yeah.
Or they're going to say, it's a threat. There's a UFO threat and we need a UFO threat office. That's the move. And all the people who are behind the UFO Threat Defense Office, which they're attaching to the National Defense Authorization Act, that's billions of dollars every year that they want for this imaginary threat. Not that UFOs are real, but the threat isn't real. So those people want to militarize the subject. And so they want to take the whole UFO threat piece. So it's crucial for us when we get these people before committees, they should be investigated. They should be interrogated for who put them up to the UFO threat side. Do you know what's happening with the DECLAS committees instead? Those very same people, and I'll name some of them here, Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, David Grush, and others. And I've interacted with these people for years, so I know their backgrounds very, very well. Those very same people, instead of being interrogated about the UFO threat and how they're trying to bilk billions of dollars out of the government, are advising the committees. So you have the counterintelligence wing controlling the Congressional committee that's supposed to get the transparency. So as a ship goes, you're going in the totally wrong direction. So either they turn the aircraft carrier of that investigative unit around, or it's just a sham for the public under the guise of saying, this is transparency, we're a DECLAS committee, and guess what? Of course, we have the best intel people telling us the UFO thing, the story about Kennedy, and it's all counterintelligence agents. And they're saying, yeah, trust these counterintelligence agents. And the counterintel people are saying, that government needs to give us the truth. But they are the government. The government pays them. And this is a long thing because one of the intelligence agents came out and said, I lost my job and I came out, I'm a whistleblower, I can't get a parking space at Langley anymore. And he did all this stuff, and then I looked into his background, and I found out with a very short investigation that he was getting paid by 4 different agencies in the government. And then when finally hit with that question, after all the softball interviews that he was given, he finally got hit with a real question by The Intercept. And they said, are you working for the government? And he said, yes, but it's not what you think.
It's not the real government. It's not.
So this is who you're dealing with. But these are the people who, are on all the podcasts, they're on Fox, they're in the intelligence committees, they're controlling the entire process. Because the Central Intelligence Agency has the entire thing in the palm of their hand. And the IC community, they control so much of this. So when you get people from, Fox News who go out and do their own podcasts, like a Megyn Kelly or whatever, she's probably a very nice, smart woman. But she sits there and she rolls out these CIA people and she's like, today we're going to talk about UFOs. You're not going to get the truth from counterintelligence people who are trained to lie about the UFO file, the most secret area of the entire national security state. So this is the nature of the problem that we face, and the committee itself becomes then a kind of a entertainment charade, which is deepening the wall of secrecy instead of getting at it, which is the executive order says, go after it, release the records, get to the bottom of the truth.
It's like they're compromised by definition.
It is, right off the bat. And, if you aren't cynical in relation to the government, I was totally open, by the way, when they announced this committee. And I gave them documentation about the people involved. And originally they seemed open to it. They were like, yeah, we're looking at your information and all the rest of it. And then they shut down. So they know that they can only go so far because somebody is in the back saying, you notice how like the media and everyone else is talking about UAP, which is the marketing rebranding of UFOs. Well, somebody is in the back saying, UAP, gravy train, the money. Talk about, UAP and the money's coming, don't worry, just front it. And that's why you have all these Congress people who don't know anything about the subject, never spend any time on it. And they're like, we want to find out about these unusual, anomalous projects that are going on. The government is ill-informed but very greedy on that level. That's the superficial compromise level. And so that is the kind of dangle out there. And what you have is a weird battle in the background where there's just traces of the media on the independent side who can call it out. And we are one of the outlets who will do that. So this program, with what we do with dark journalism, the first thing you do if you want to get at the truth of the UFO file is you don't have counterintelligence people involved. Simple. You want to get the best liar to give you the truth, you know? It's like asking a serial killer for, you know, a comfort and understanding.
I'm sure a serial killer would be able to give you a hug. Not so sure about the other thing. Thank you for that. Can you tell me what is the modern basis of the covert infrastructure of a parallel government system? How is it funded and kept secret from government oversight?
Yeah, it's an excellent point. At a certain point in this setup of the Central Intelligence Agency taking over exotic technology, there was a decision made somewhere along the line that we need something off the books. And so the black budget was created, but for years it thrived in secrecy. And really there's an article in the Miami Herald from 1987 that is the first reference in history to the black budget, which is an entirely secret system that is skimmed off of the income of different programs. So for example, a number of researchers that have come on my show have done investigations about missing money. Mm-hmm. And so they have missing money at NASA, they have missing money at HUD, they have missing money from the DOD, and every year...
The Pentagon?
Exactly. The Pentagon, the DOD, this whole infrastructure, they are failing the audits because what is going on with them? They're getting tremendous amounts of money. And one of the things I raised some warnings about in relation to the group that's controlling the UFO conversation on the Hill is what they're doing is they're attaching these UFO defense offices to the National Defense Authorization Act. And the Authorization Act is something that gives $1 trillion every year to all of our defense. So these people in the committees, if you attach something like a UFO defense office to it, as they have in the Senate Intelligence Committee for 2025, if you object to it and you say no, then they can go around and they say, oh, you're holding up $1 trillion worth of this money and it's not fair, our servicemen will go hungry if you don't do this, all these kinds of things, which is ridiculous because that's on a completely different budget schedule and nobody's going to go hungry with it except the military defense contractors. So they have a pretty good system there, but that NDAA has been used on a number of different occasions to slide through things and attach them. So for example, after the 9/11 emergency, we came under emergency powers. And we're still under the same emergency powers that happened during 9/11, the Patriot Act and all of those things. That's because the NDAA has attached to it the September 11th emergency. And every president, whether you're Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, they all sign on the dotted line for the September 11th emergency because so much of this is about the utilization of emergency powers. So I guess structurally, in terms of the money, they have a very well-designed black budget system, but it is feeding a black budget infrastructure. And that infrastructure accounts for incredible underground construction, and it also accounts for incredible space programs that we know nothing about, that we refer to as the secret space program and the secret space architecture. This whole thing that's been going on since 1972 when it went black, so the last time we ended up going to the moon with the Apollo program is 53 years ago. Well, what happened in between? So they were like, oh, we're going back to the moon now. Where have you been for 53 years? I mean, you've been making something out in space. Where is it? The public paid for it. So this is the nature of the problem. And if you go back, if you track it, and this is why the Kennedy aspect has to be understood as the kind of crucial linchpin about how we took this fork in the road off into the situation that we're in now. If you look at it, Kennedy was saying, NASA, I found things where he's saying, why are there two space programs at NASA? One, Blue Gemini, which nobody even knows where it came from, and the other one that we recommended. Like, go to NASA, he sends his defense secretary, McNamara, and say, I'll kick this back to the military unless you get rid of one. Like, what are you doing? That program's secret. Who's operating it? The president wants to know who's operating a completely different space program. That's 1963. So what is it that's going on in relation to this now? There's a famous conversation that takes place between Reagan and Gorbachev. And this happens at a a summit that's not very widely known. It's the Reykjavik summit in Iceland. And when they came out of that, everyone thought, you know, they haven't accomplished anything. They couldn't reach an agreement. And it was all because Reagan had a program called Star Wars. And it was the Strategic Defense Initiative. And originally the idea was it'll shoot down missiles so there'll never be a nuclear threat in relation to this. Mm-hmm. So Gorbachev comes out, you know, in 2012, and he's at the New York Press Club talking with Charlie Rose. And he starts talking about this, and he says, you know, President Reagan took me aside during that summit at Reykjavik, and he said, will you help us with the UFO threat? And if we're attacked by these UFOs, will you work together? Can we work together? And Gorbachev said he was taken aback with the question, but he said, oh yeah, absolutely. And then he turns to the people that are in the audience there, like Henry Kissinger and George Shultz and all these national security honchos, and he says, I'm sorry to have mentioned this, but it's a crucial thing for us to keep in mind that Reagan wanted our help to fight this UFO threat. Now, that's a conversation that took place between two leaders in 1987. So what is it that they're looking at? And how is it that something else is coming in the middle there and making sure that the Russians and the Americans don't talk to each other? It relates directly to the UFO, which is the problem that Kennedy had, which is that he wanted to share the UFO file with the Russians so we wouldn't have this issue. So there's something in the secrecy about whatever that exotic technology related to the UFO file is. This is what we're talking about. And that's why things like the DECLAS Committee and the congressional hearings on this, if they don't go into Kennedy's relationship to the aerospace programs, or they don't go into the fact that Kennedy was assassinated over the aerospace programs, you're never going to get to the truth of any of it. Mm-hmm. And that goes for the UFO hearings too. And as a matter of fact, I guess the ultimate slap on the Kennedy assassination and his legacy is to have CIA people running a UFO committee. That is the ultimate diss.
That is a kick in the head.
I mean, that's rich.
Daniel, can you please tell me what are some of the witness stories you would like to see that the DECLAS Committee explore in relation to the JFK assassination, even though 60 years have passed?
Yeah, there's a number of them that were kind of blacked out of history. They've been blotted out, as though were. There's so many to choose from. I'm going to choose two. The Ricky White story and also Judith Exner story, because they're both crucial to the aerospace side on this. But Ricky White, I'll summarize it this way. It's very interesting. Ricky was the son of Roscoe White. Roscoe White had a very unusual history. They didn't know much about him, but he was on the Dallas police force. In fact, he had joined the Dallas police force only 7 weeks before the assassination took place. And at a certain point, Roscoe becomes an unusual character in all this because nobody had guessed he had anything to do with the assassination. And then he dies mysteriously in 1971 in an explosion. And as his family is going through his belongings, they find something quite unusual. They find among his belongings, because he was one of the photo experts for the police as well, and he would do a lot of photo work for them. There's been a lot of controversy over the years about Lee Harvey Oswald and how he was framed with this picture. And Life magazine put it on the cover. And the picture, we're going to show it during this segment, but just for everybody to look at. But why don't you and I look at it anyway? And it's quite interesting because the picture shows, just give me a second to get that. There's a few of Oswald here. You hold that one and I'll hold this one. This is quite interesting. So that was the same picture that we're showing on the screen right now. And basically what it shows, and this is the picture that convicted in the public mind, Oswald, which is, it's showing him in his left hand, he's holding the rifle that supposedly assassinated President Kennedy. In his right hand is a communist manifesto, and on his hip is a pistol, a revolver, which they will definitely say later that he shot a policeman with. So you got everything there in one picture.
Except I am guilty across his forehead.
Where's the tattoo?
Probably was too subtle.
Exactly. They were going for broke with this. There's no question about it. And I'm a madman, you know.
Guns blazing, literally.
Now, this second picture that we'll show on the screen is quite interesting. It is, in fact, the same picture, but it's like kind of 1960s Photoshop. And what it shows is the exact same background information and everything else, but it's a cutout. And it shows the same holding the rifle shadow and all the rest. As you can see, this picture is quite interesting because it was found among the possessions of Roscoe White after this explosion. And with his photography work, it tied him into the JFK assassination in a way that researchers became very intrigued with. Well, in 1990, with this story just lay dormant, they didn't know quite what to do with it. But in fact, it was picked up in the committee hearings in the late 1970s. The House Assassination Committee picked it up and looked at Roscoe White because they found out something else that was unusual. Roscoe White was in the same Marine unit with Lee Harvey Oswald, and he had gone over to Atsugi in Japan with him, and he had been recruited into military intelligence. Now, as we know, Oswald also was recruited into the CIA, but that's not public. So they're both at a top secret base there in Atsugi, which is like the Area 51 of Japan, developing the U-2. So Oswald is typically portrayed as kind of a slovenly guy, you know, beat his wife, worked for $1.25 an hour, was disgruntled, and just had to kill the president because. Well, if you go back into that history with him and Roscoe White, you're going to find he is, in fact, with a higher security clearance than many of the people on that base. And a lot of the people who came out later to talk about him, like Kerry Thornley, who were, you know, fellow Marines, they were like, oh yeah, Oswald had a higher security clearance than we did. Well, so much for, you know, this perennial loser that Oswald was. He has a high security clearance at Atsugi. So both he and Roscoe White are there, and then they're both there in Dallas right at the point of the JFK assassination. Remember, Oswald himself doesn't get the job at the Texas School Book Depository until 6 weeks before the assassination. Now, nobody knows that President Kennedy is going to Dallas at the time. It's not listed anywhere. And even the people on the inside haven't decided. The only people who know are the people who were shaping that on the inside for President Kennedy. They're putting together the Texas trip. And so Oswald getting the job, if he were this disgruntled loser, how lucky would you have to get to be a disgruntled loser who hates the president, who happens to get a job right on the limousine route that he's going to be by where you can shoot him from the window? That's pretty good luck for a guy, considering Kennedy hadn't even been to Texas since the election. So this is an extraordinary set of circumstances, but the other person that's there 8 weeks before the assassination is Roscoe White. Well, he'd been in the military this whole time, military intelligence. He comes in and he works for the police. Now he's there at the scene of the crime. And when the bullets go out of the window of the Texas School Book Depository in the classic story, the person who owns the building, as I mentioned earlier, also is a person who runs an experimental aerospace company. That company, by the way, LTV, Link Temco Vout, will invest $3 million at that period of time in their advanced technology. And by 1965, which is only 2 years after the assassination, that $3 million investment is worth $55 million in 1965 money. So you're talking $500 million. That's a pretty good payoff just for using the center there. So I'm going to stick to White, even though there's something very interesting about the owner of the Texas School Book Depository we'll explore. So Ricky White is the son who grows up without a father, because in this explosion, as you know, a lot of people around the Kennedy assassination disappear. They die in some unusual fashion. And it's interesting to note that an actuary was polled and hired in 1971 to figure out what were the odds, the actual odds, of all the people who were witnesses to the Kennedy assassination dying in this mysterious fashion. And they had 36 of them listed there. There's a much larger number, actually, but just with the 36. And the actuarial result came back with this response. The odds of all of them dying by 1971 were 100,000 trillion to 1. So they had a death list campaign there. There's no question about it. Roscoe White was definitely on that. He knew too much. And the only reason we know that is because, very strangely, in 1990, Ricky White, Roscoe's son, comes out and said, I had a diary of my dad, and in his diary, he talked about his participation in removing a national security threat. There's the same language that Hunt was using about Kennedy. And as he moves through it, he realizes the dates and everything. It's the Kennedy assassination that he's a part of. And he puts it down in a diary, hides it, and it's in a cabin that the family owns. He goes to the cabin, he finds the diary, and he can't believe what he's discovering. And it's a 400-page diary with meticulous notes. Now, he comes out and he goes directly to the FBI. And he says, not only that, there's a key here to a safety deposit box. I'm sure there's a lot going on with this. The FBI say, where did you get this material? What's going on here? And he said, I think my father was involved in the Kennedy assassination. So he said, they said, bring us to the cabin, give us all the stuff. And he gives them all the stuff. And they said, give us the diary too. Now, this is the Federal Bureau of Investigation who takes the diary. Right now we have an FBI director who's all in on the transparency, Kash Patel. He can order, by the way, this diary to be retrieved because the FBI took it. They took it from Ricky White and they never returned it. And so he asked them, he petitioned them over and over again. He never gets the diary back. Finally, they say, we never saw a diary. Now, he was already doing television specials. His family had already seen the diary. Everybody already knew about the thing. The stonewalling of the FBI saying there is no diary is absurd. But they got away with it then. Eventually they would say, oh, that Ricky White, he was telling a story for money. Well, look, if he was telling the story for money, produce the diary and debunk it. But if you're hiding it behind FBI archives, then that's a totally different thing. Roscoe White is important because he shows that he's involved very deeply in the assassination plot. What we were able to learn from Ricky White's diary, from what he remembered, was that each of the positions and the various names that they gave to themselves, and his position was shooting in a certain particular portion of behind this fence. And of course, there's a number of things about somebody called Badge Man that come out in photography that show what appears to be someone in a police uniform shooting. That is Roscoe White. And Roscoe White was very deeply involved in the crime. And it's very interesting because the more we got into Ricky White's story about it, the more you realize, oh, there's a good reason they took the diary. This would look really, really bad and explode the case at the worst possible time in 1990 when they thought they had buried the whole thing. He was forced underground. He's gone completely off the radar. In fact, I've tried to reach him on a number of occasions. But Ricky White, his story can't come forward. However, the DECLAS Committee has the power to petition Kash Patel to say the FBI took this diary of Roscoe White from Ricky White and go in and return it, produce it. So that's what a DECLAS Committee can do. Instead of having a bunch of counterintelligence agents talk about this stuff, or say JFK had an affair with someone who was in the mafia, no, they've got a real case. Roscoe White was military intelligence, and he had fixed this piece of evidence. They found it among his possessions, and the diary story. For me, there are too many witnesses to it. The diary was real. The question is, exactly what did the FBI do with it? The Ricky White story needs to be brought out. The DECLAS Committee can do it, and my suggestion is that Ricky White himself would come out now after 30 years in hiding and say to the DECLAS Committee, show up during one of the hearings and say, I'm here, have Kash Patel give me the diary. This is the kind of thing that committee can do. Remember, the committee's gone in September. There's nothing, you can't do anything. So if you want to get at those things in the government, it's a time-limited window. This is the stuff that they can do. And what we're seeing, there's a lot of fluff with this thing. As a matter of fact, what they're doing with a lot of the DECLAS posters, and you'll appreciate this, is they're showing Luna, who's in charge of the panel, who's a congresswoman from Florida, and God bless her, I hope she gets the job done. But she produced a JFK hearing that was one of the worst pieces of fluff I've ever watched in my life. It was terrible. Where they talked about, hey, they let out somebody's social security number, but the guy had died in 1969. So it was useless. But anyway, they have these movie posters of her, and it's like, the DECLAS, I'll get at the truth, and they show her face, and they have the whole thing, and everyone that comes out, they look like movie posters. So this is what they're doing with it. That has nothing to do with disclosure. It's a completely marketing effort on behalf of Congress, and it's going to look like, hey, we looked into the JFK thing, we released the records. Well, they didn't release the Joanides records. Joanides, I've identified on this program, it's a Washington Post reporter who brought him out. Nobody even knew he existed. Mm-hmm. And he's their top psychological warfare officer who created the Oswald operation. You think his records are important? I would say so, yeah. So he's the guy, if you track him through history, no one even knew he existed until 2005. He's dead now, by the way. But the person, he earned the Career Intelligence Medal, which is a rare achievement in the CIA. And the person who gives him the medal is Bobby Inman. Bobby Inman shows up in so much of my reporting because Bobby Inman is that interface person between the intelligence community and the exotic technology. And as a matter of fact, in 1990, Inman, after serving as Deputy CIA Director, NSA Director, he was an admiral. He was friends with John Warner's dad. John Warner's dad was the head of the Navy, and that majestic group all hung out together, the ones who handled the UFO file. Inman is the one who gets selected to give the Career Intelligence Medal to Joanides, because Joanides saved the UFO project from Kennedy's meddling. This is the nature of the problem. Inman, in 1990, comes out and says, you know what? Not only do we know what the UFO craft are, but we know who's inside operating them. That's a top Central Intelligence Agency figure on record. And he said it to UFO investigator Timothy Good, and he never went back on it later. Now, he ended up working at SAIC and all these very, very murky technology groups over the years. He's still alive. The DECLAS Committee can subpoena him and ask him as a friendly witness or as a hostile witness to answer the questions about why the CIA gave Joanides the Career Intelligence Medal. I guarantee you, along with his many, sort of infamous activities, that the reason they gave him the medal was because the Oswald project saved the UFO file. And that's why Inman is there, standing there, giving it to him. So the Joanides files not coming out is a big kick in the face to transparency efforts, because what it says is there is no disclosure. You get frill documents and you don't get the real thing.